In, we're here in the European Parliament with Dr. Stephan Singer. We've just been hearing about food security and the role that meat eating plays with regards to climate change and CO2 emissions. Now, obviously, this is going to, or we hope this is going to have some sort of impact in Copenhagen and negotiations. Where do you think this lays at the moment?
Well, first of all, we don't believe that the issue of lifestyle changes as proposed here, and as useful and necessary those are, to give individuals a chance, particularly in rich countries, to reduce their impact on the planet, their footprint, by reducing meat consumption. We fear that this will not play a big role in Copenhagen. This is something which individuals have to do themselves, which should be incentivized by governments, because indeed reduced meat consumption, reduced beef consumption in particular, has many benefits for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing water consumption, reducing air and water pollution, and on top of that, saving land and protecting nature, because the conversion of grain to meat protein involves a factor of 7 to 10. So you need about 7 to 10 times more land to produce the same amount of protein or calories if you eat meat or if you were be eating vegetables. I think that's very important in terms of food security, in terms of limited land availability, not necessarily in Europe but worldwide. If people would have the same diet, the same average diet. We don't talk about increasing meat consumption. We talk about the same diet as every American would have. We would need about 3 times the size of agricultural land on this planet. If every person would have the diet of the average European, we would need up to 2 times the arable land in the world. Because we are lucky, the Indians and the Chinese are still vegetarians because they're still on average quite poor. So we should evaluate that one and have a more sustainable, more responsible choice in our diet. And many people live very healthy by not eating too much meat. This is not about turning everyone into vegetarian, but this is about having much less meat to help to protect the planet. This can be done on an individual basis, does not need necessarily intervention by governments. On Copenhagen, WWF goes to Copenhagen was basically 4 key demands. Let me fleck them out to you. The one thing is, we need, as a principle based on science, a very strong emission reduction commitment by the group of developed countries in the range of up to 40% emission reductions below 1990 by 2020. That is simply required by science if we want to stay below 2-degree global warming, which has been agreed by the European Union and by now by 120 nations. It's a consequential result of that one. Otherwise, we have problems of meeting that target in the long term. Second, we need substantive funding as well from the rich nations to help developing countries to adapt to climate change, to combat deforestation, and also help them with new technologies for mitigating climate change in the more technical areas of energy and industries. Thirdly, the outcome of Copenhagen needs to be as much legally binding as possible. There was a big debate in the media recently, and we have the big fear that those who start to talk a political declaration or politically binding agreement, whatever that one is, have nothing else in mind than basically undermining the likely compliance regime and getting us on the slippery slope of a voluntary agreement. We have lots of evidence, not only in Europe, worldwide, with UN agreements which are based on voluntary agreements. They all have not worked. They were miserably violated. Millennium Development Goals, anti-poverty goals, disarmament goals, whatever you want. You can take many treaties which are not necessarily linked to environment, which have been violated because they were not legally binding. The Kyoto Protocol, and as imperfect its compliance regime may be, has actually worked. It has a legally binding character. The only country which is not likely to comply with Kyoto is Canada. All the other countries are very likely to comply with the Kyoto regime because it has a legally binding character. But it's not only the compliance regime, it's not only the stick and the carrots. The review of adequacy of commitments, the proper scientific review over time must be part of a binding character. The reporting, the monitoring, all these tacky issues which keeps countries responsible to their data and to their actions and consequences must be based on a legally binding path. All those speak against the voluntary agreement. And the fourth issue is the deal must be made on a fair base. I think that's fundamentally important, that we help developing countries with our money, with our support, with a variety of our financial institutions to help them decarbonize and add to their ongoing actions. Fairness also includes that we recognize that developing countries already take many actions which have been not necessarily acknowledged to that extent as they could have been. I'll give you a couple of examples, very much as I talk about what China has recently committed, but there are many more other countries. South Africa has taken a commitment 2 years ago to principally peak their emissions and reduce their emissions post 2020, independent and unconditional what happens in Copenhagen. The Philippines have a target of 50% renewables by 2020 in the entire country. It's the most ambitious renewable energy target of any country in the world. And they have not made that conditional to any agreement or to any funding from the North. Brazil is talking about a target of 80% reduction in deforestation by 2020. Indonesia has, by its president, has agreed on picking up a target of 10 to 15% reduction of deforestation, unconditional of any funding anyway. I can give you many examples of other countries which taking actions, and I think that should be acknowledged, and we should do everything what we can in the North to help those countries to not only comply with those targets, but probably over-comply to them. That's what's needed.
Now, obviously, as you're discussing that, one of the big issues, one of the sticking issues from everything we're reading is financing. Now, just last week, Gordon Brown was announcing there was going to be a funding package. Is that kind of thing going to be big enough? Is it going to do what's required, or is more necessary?
There's much more necessary, but I don't want to be cynical. For WWF, it's very important to quick start the financing for developing country. And we also need the 10 to 15 billion currently proposed to be annually and not just overall for a couple of years. Otherwise, it would be just a little bit, it would be not good enough. It must be also additional to existing ODA funding. It cannot be that existing ODA, Overseas Development Agent, Overseas Development Support for Developing Countries, is being diluted, that we make a trade-off between funding hospitals for the poor, safe drinking water for the poor in the south with climate change mitigation. That would be very cynical. It must be additional to those needed humanitarian and social needs for the poor. I think some countries are getting it, not everyone is getting it, and that's the biggest fight. And of course the dimension. We need to go to at least for the entire world, not just the EU, with something like between 100 and 150 billion euro per year funding for developing countries, for adaptation, mitigation, and also combating deforestation. That sounds a lot. It is probably a lot, but overall, it's much less compared to what we would have to pay for all the damages of climate change. We always tend to forget that one. This is an investment in our future, not only in the south, here as well. It's an investment in sea level rise. It's an investment for our own agriculture, for our own food security. We tend to forget that one very often, and all this money is being seen, oh my goodness, it's so much, it's so much. No, it's not much, because it's much less than what the impacts of climate change would cost us.
Okay, well, Dr. Singer, thank you very much. I wish you luck in Copenhagen. Thank you.